Okay, welcome to How Good's Innovation Online series. We're focusing on biodiversity, regenerative agriculture, and planetary health. Planetary health is very interesting. We've had a whole mix from circular economy to thinking about sustainability and nutrition. And today, something that is actually front of mind for a lot of people in terms of the health of the planet is the health of the water, the health of the ocean, and the impact of our packaging and our single-use plastics and plastics in general on that. And so this is our focus for today, is regenerative packaging. And as Jane and I were saying before you all arrived, this isn't quite a conversation that is front and center for many people yet. It's like we're a little bit out ahead, which is exactly where we like to be when innovating, is on the edge where people are just, everyone's talking about reducing packaging and sustainable packaging. And we want to sort of flip it and ask a bigger question of what would regenerative packaging even look like? So our thought leader today is Jane Franch, Director of Strategic Sourcing and Sustainability at Numi Organic Tea. We'll do these brief introductions, have about a 30-minute conversation between Jane and I, do some community breakouts, and then get to the Q&A. Before we launch in, I'll just say that there's a few talks left in this series. One that is really exciting is regenerative product development with Jesse Smith and Lauren Tucker from the White Buffalo Land Trust. They're developing a 1,000-acre regenerative agriculture center in California. And then I'm going to do a final talk with our research director, Arthur Gillette, who's come up with a whole new tool. It's called carbon opportunity cost, or the forest delta, which is like an upgrade to how LCAs are done to account for some fine-grained details of basically what could be happening if a forest were growing there, not just your crop compared to a blank field of crops. So that's coming up in September. We welcome you to join those. And then I'll also say that as we wrap up this series, we're in the process of designing and lining up thought leaders for our next series, which is going to focus on biodiversity, regenerative agriculture, and environmental justice, and focus on amplifying the voices of Black, Indigenous, Latino, Asian farmers and food entrepreneurs to really highlight what's happening at that intersection with biodiversity and regenerative agriculture. So that's that. I will stop sharing screen and say hi, Jane. Welcome.
Hi, Ethan. How are you today?
I'm great. I'm excited to have you here. So we're going to dig in on regenerative packaging, but maybe just give us a bit of a quick kind of background. How did you come to land on and care about packaging, and then even start to think about it in a regenerative way? What's some of the backstory that got you there?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you had told me 10 years ago that I would be this interested in packaging, I probably would have scratched my head or, really questioned that. But yeah, I mean, I've been with Numi Tea for 5 years now. And when I arrived at Numi 5 years ago, really thinking, oh, I'm going to be working on our supply chains and with our tea farmers. One of the more exciting initiatives that I was handed was our packaging initiative that had already been underway under the leadership of Brian Durkee, and of course, our founders, Ahmed and Reem as well. And that initiative had been kind of underway for about 4 years already, and it was this dream of creating, earth-to-earth packaging that was completely, not just impact neutral, but kind of impact positive, that wasn't leaving anything behind. And that had gone through many trials and iterations, and I've had the good fortune over the last 5 years of shepherding that project kind of over the finish line and getting us to a plant-based packaging that we launched in January for our flexible film for our tea wrappers. And that whole process has just been, so fascinating and interesting to get into the, supply chain dynamics, the economics, the, technical requirements of packaging, and of course, all of the really just bright, driven, motivated people working across, the supply chain on this issue.
So you spoke to it a little bit, but what would regenerative packaging, what does that even mean? What does regenerative even mean in the context of packaging from your perspective?
That's a great question. We think about regenerative, most commonly in the context of agriculture, where we can sort of conceptually visualize what a regenerative agricultural field would look like, or what a regenerative forest would look like. We don't think about it quite so much with packaging. You know, I think about it on the most basic level as earth-to-earth packaging, so packaging that really remains a part of the nutrient cycle within a reasonable time frame. You know, of course, you know, you could say that petroleum-derived packaging, it is part of the nutrient cycle if you look at it on this really ginormous time frame, right? And eventually those carbon molecules will again become uninhibited carbon molecules. But that time frame is so large that a lot of damage is happening in between. So really it's thinking about it, thinking about that packaging, you know, not as kind of a standalone single-use item, but rather as an item that is nested within a larger system and that retains the quality of, you know, being a positive contributor to that larger system, which to me I like the language of earth to earth. You know, we're hearing a lot about circularity right now. And I think it's really valuable to think about the time horizon that we're talking about in circularity. And for that reason, I find earth to earth being a little bit more practical, because we can really think about it as sprouting up from the earth, you know, going through its use phase, and then, you know, returning back to the earth where it can repeat the cycle again.
And so you're talking mainly about the impact of the packaging itself. Is there anything else that you would see that packaging could do to have a regenerative effect along with just the impact it itself has? And does that play into your thinking about regeneration?
Absolutely. You know, I think one of the things that, you know, in thinking about this, that, you know, we have to admit about packaging, if you kind of stop and think about the innovations that have taken place in packaging in the last 5 years, you know, we now have these wonderful zippers on our stand-up pouches. We have stand-up pouches to begin with, right? We didn't have those, you know, 5 years ago. It was always a bag in a box. Now we have stand-up pouches with resealable zippers and different kind of zippers. We have easy pull-off, you know, wrappers on top of, you know, hard shell, rigid produce containers. We have an amazing variety of materials, of plastics that are combinations of different adhesives and resins and layers that do the most delightful and amazing things, so that when we receive that product as a consumer, you know, the packaging is not an impediment to enjoying that product inside of it. And moreover, the packaging itself might delight and surprise us, right? You know, and we don't consider ourselves to be buying that packaging. But what's the subtle shift that has taken place in packaging over the last 5 or 10 years is a shift that's led to like a consumer expectation that packaging will, you know, be kind of a nice sort of like a ribbon around this lovely thing that I'm going to ingest. And that expectation is really grounded in this concept of each of us individually being our own kind of self-contained islands, right? Where, you know, what the experience I'm having in this moment is mine and mine alone, and it's not connected to anything else that's happening, you know, in the planet or in my community, or, you know, kind of outside of me and myself in this moment. And that really is the opposite of regenerative thinking. You know, regenerative thinking really it challenges us to get beyond that individualistic mindset and to envision ourselves and our actions as nested and cross-linked within a highly complex kind of planetary system. And that, I think, is one of the most powerful notes that we have in packaging to really be a part of that shift in thinking that, you know, kind of we all need to go through to arrive at planetary health.
Amazing. So, and yet packaging isn't necessarily the most impactful if you're just looking at raw greenhouse gas emissions or water. It's not necessarily the most impactful part of many products, though some it is. So I don't know, can you just talk a bit about that? Like what is the impact of the packaging versus a particular product? And you could use, you know, examples from your company or elsewhere. And how should we think about that? Should we be focusing as much attention on packaging as we are currently? Or how do you see that in the mix?
Yeah, I mean, I think we should be focusing more on packaging. one of the things we're beginning to see is just, we're kind of waking up to right now is the prevalence of microplastics. I was had the opportunity to go to Yellowstone for the first time this year, which was totally amazing, beautiful, such a wild, rugged place. And while I was out there, because I was doing some reading in science of what's kind of happening in that ecosystem, and came across an article stating that they found microplastics in Yellowstone, right? They found it in the tundra of the Arctic. It's everywhere throughout our whole system, even places where people are not. And I think that's one thing that we need to do a better job of is fully including the impacts of microplastics and microplastic accumulation. And the time horizon of microplastic accumulation into our modeling and consideration of what the impact of plastic is. I think the other really important thing to think about when we talk about kind of LCAs around packaging, it's really important to remember that the existing system that we are in right now is the result of over 60 years of supply chain development from the petrochemical industry, where incredible efficiencies have been achieved in that industry over the lifespan of this industry over the last 60 years. If we think about like that classic example in the Life magazine in the 1950s, where they're kind of throwing up the plastic packaging and joy and excitement, right? How far we've come now in terms of the use and proliferation of plastic. And all of those efficiencies have led to a ecosystem in which, it is extremely efficient, to transform, petrochemical molecules into like a huge variety of end-use plastics, right? That of course makes sense. It is difficult to compare that to a completely nascent industry that's just now working to get itself off its feet. We have not yet reached like the efficiency of scale with the emerging, compostable and bio-based packaging industries that we have with the petrochemical industry, where, for example, like, the inputs and the outputs are all aligned geographically, and, those manufacturers are nearby to, then the extruders and the printers, right? We don't yet have those kind of nodes within the ecosystem that are fully developed that make it, useful in any way to compare the two as apples to apples.
Right. And this, takes us towards talking a bit more about some of those materials, but just to go on that point of the LCAs, the life cycle assessments, and when you do it of synthetic petrochemical based plastics versus bio-based plastics, the other thing that I think isn't tracked as well right now is that most of the life cycle assessments, for example, for corn or for sugar, relies on a model of growing corn or sugar that comes from that same industrial agriculture practices and approach. And so it may look like, oh wow, if we're going to have to grow the sugarcane and then transform it into something because of the huge impacts in sugarcane, which mostly come from the petrochemical fertilizers that are put on it, then that's just going to make the impact of the bio packaging itself really terrible. But that totally leaves out the potential of regenerative agriculture in the growing of those materials. So if you're growing a regenerative sugar, if you're pulling from regenerative forestry into a cellulosic base, if you're pulling from a regenerative cornfield, then the numbers actually change, but the science, the LCA science hasn't caught up to that yet. And as you're saying, there isn't enough supply yet, though I think we're getting closer and closer, so that's even necessarily reasonable to model off of and then expect, oh, I could make all my packaging out of that. So I think that's an interesting kind of nuance to hold as well, along with what you were saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And we are beginning to see, the emergence of some, like, for example, one of the really, most widely used cellophanes out there, which is a eucalyptus derived cellophane. It's FSC certified. It's from Futamura. And that's widely used in Europe, and now increasingly we're starting to see it here in the US. And that's a great example of what you were saying, right? Where, you're starting with an FSC certified eucalyptus and, building the supply chain from there. And that's a big change from, where we started with bioplastics. with kind of genetically modified corn, becoming a PLA.
Got it. So what are some of the materials? I don't know, what would you say, what are the, I'm not going to say what are regenerative materials, but what are the most regenerative, or the ones that you feel like are kind of on the pathway to that packaging designers and people can be thinking about and looking towards and using and maybe even also investing in developing so that more of that supply continues. What do you see out there?
Well, I think right now what we've seen, as kind of proven examples, where we've made it through like concept, proof of concept and on to actual like applications that are now starting to proliferate is, definitely, as I mentioned the Nature Flex, which is a eucalyptus derived cellophane material. It's a wonderful barrier. Works in a lot of different applications, can be extruded in different thicknesses, you can print on it, has a lot of flexibility. And, has, as I mentioned, has a great barrier strength. And then you've got some PLAs now as well. And PLA, of course, comes with like a kind of a loaded history. And I think with PLAs, it's very, very important to understand where your PLA is coming from. And so now we're beginning to see the emergence of some, definitely more non-GMO PLAs, which is good. And now there is a Bonsucro certified PLA on the market that is not only non-GMO, it's coming from sugarcane, but it's also Bonsucro certified, which is a sustainable standard that addresses the farming and the working conditions on that particular production field. There's not enough supply now, but we are beginning to see that. And as kind of demand increases, then hopefully supply will as well. I think the other really interesting material that is still, hasn't quite made it out of the innovation phase is the PHAs. And PHAs are in concept, they're very, very cool. So what we've seen is already a couple of different incubators that have demonstrated that you can use, methane digesting microbes in a biodigester attached to, for example, a municipal wastewater facility. And those microbes can actually consume the solid waste and turn that into a PHA molecule. And a PHA molecule has similar, some similar qualities to a PLA molecule. But we have not yet really gotten past that kind of raw PHA pellet into a actual functional, either rigid or film that is combined with all the different adhesives and coatings and other elements that kind of go into a piece of packaging to yield an actual functional product on the other side.
Yeah, and so just a note, PLA is polylactic acid and PHA is a polyhydroxyalkanoate. And they're both polymers that are building off of some, fundamental, smaller bio-based building blocks. And like you were saying, at scale, PHA is still we're getting pellets, but there are some very interesting pilots, as you mentioned, that are heading towards films or even towards a rigid construction for a water bottle or something like that that are happening now. So aside from sort of the growth in PHA, what other materials, either the materials themselves or the sort of feedstock to the materials, what do you think in 5 to 10 years, what are we going to see? What are we going to be working with? What would you sort of like keep your eye out for coming down the road?
Well, there's a lot of discussion about, in the biomimicry world, I think there's a huge amount of excitement and discussion around, like innovating materials that work like, different types of animal skins or plant fibers. And that's really exciting. I haven't seen, so far, that seems to be more in the ideation phase than actual, kind of reality phase. I have gotten some samples of some interesting, something recently crossed my radar recently that was like derived from the SCOBY of kombucha. You can somehow take the SCOBY and turn it into some kind of a packaging, right? And then something also from fungus recently, making kind of a fiberboard, so I think there's some very interesting stuff out there that's starting to kind of percolate and pop up. You know, many of these really exciting and innovative ideas, they come back to this, you know, kind of crux of consumer expectation around packaging, I think. And the ability of these materials to kind of advance and go forward, you know, depends in a large part to, you know, I think opening up consumers' minds to, you know, the regenerative component of packaging, right? You know, and the fact that packaging itself, you know, once we can look at it and think about it as much of a living part of that product as the product itself, then we can start to have different expectations of it. We can understand that, like, if it's sitting on the shelf for 2 years, it's probably not going to look the same as it looked on day one, right? And when we can start to kind of shift those expectations and those ideas around what our packaging should do, and you know, kind of the time horizon within which, you know, we're going to be consuming our food and producing our food and packaging it and expecting it to be kind of in a static state for us, you know, that's really going to open up a new horizon around, you know, what we can use for packaging materials.
How have you reconciled some of those, just all the different factors you were speaking about in the development of your packaging? And, you know, don't give away any secrets, but, you know, what did you figure out for your tea bags that got them to a state that is well beyond what anybody else is doing? Just tell us a bit about them.
Yeah, so our tea bags are a 3-layer structure. They're flexible film, and the outside is a FSC certified paper layer. And then we have the barrier layer is the eucalyptus derived cellophane, and then the interior is a Bonsucro certified PLA. And those 3 are laminated together. It's a pretty beefy structure, but we really want to make sure that that tea is protected and arrives to our consumers in a beautiful, you know, premium way. And then in addition to those 3 layers, I mean, I think one piece that's often overlooked is there are also, there's varnish, there's ink, and there's a few other things in there, right? So, you know, it's not just those 3 layers, it's also, you know, we've had to go to the lab to actually innovate a unique over varnish, you know, that kind of goes over the print layer. That functions within a compostable environment and that's free from, you know, toxic elements, right? And I think people really overlook that piece of it as well. The fact that, like, you know, most paperboard has small amounts of latex in the covering of that paperboard so that you can actually print on it, right? So the innovation that we've had to do, you know, not Numi personally, but, you know, our supply chain partners have done to develop unique coatings, varnishes, print layers that function within a compostable environment. And what I mean by that is that they not only biodegrade within a set amount of time, but they do so without leaving behind, you know, ecotoxicity. So that, I think, has been one of the biggest challenges, is not just those kind of gross layers, those 3 gross layers, but all those micro layers that are kind of in there as well. So over the years, we've had to, you know, we've gone through, I don't know how many different plant trials, first of all, to find the material that'll actually run on our manufacturing equipment. But then, you know, also we've gone through, I think, at least 2 or 3 rounds of compostability testing. And at the end of, you know, the first failed round, I mean, we went to the extent of sending the material to, you know, to a lab with an electron microscope so we could see how you know, what was happening to it and why the microbes weren't actually getting into the layers that we thought were going to work so well, because we were using all the right compostable varnishes and lacquers and coatings, but they still weren't getting into it. So, you know, that whole discovery along the way, it's yeah, I mean, I could go on and on about all of that, but it really has been a journey and kind of all hands on deck with our packaging manufacturers, honestly, and with their partners as well. So not just the folks who are doing our lamination and our printing, but all of the ancillary suppliers that they have that, you know, they're now asking to come up with innovative new formulas and recipes, you know, for these different components of the package.
And is that something that they can only do for you, or have they now gained that capability and, have that available more in the industry?
It's our hope that they have now gained that ability and that is available in the industry and others can go and run with it. And I think that's what we're seeing. One of the things that I would say about our journey, I think people sometimes say, wow, 10 years, that's a long time. And my response to this is, it's taken us 10 years because we started 10 years ago, and 10 years ago, nobody was doing any of this, right? If you start today, chances are you can go out onto the marketplace and find at least one or two things that probably could work, So what we started at the point when, there was really nothing available. I mean, in fact, we had called some of the big manufacturers, Innovia, and some of the big packaging extruders, and nobody would return our phone calls. They thought compostable packaging, like, what are you talking about? And so we actually founded an industry group called OST2 that brought together different brands to kind of put our heads together around this issue. And once we had a number of different brands at the table, we were able to pick up that phone again, and they flew right out here. They came to a meeting, in our conference room, and were ready to talk to us about what we needed and what our industry needed, around compostable packaging. And so, all of that kind of development and kind of market emergence has been happening over the last 10 years. And one of the really exciting things right now is we're at this kind of moment of emergence, right? Where we're kind of going from conceptual and something that felt really far away to really having a lot of big time excitement and interest from, huge industry players that we need on board who are really pulling through. And that's both on kind of the retailer side, saying like, we want zero waste packaging in our stores, to large industrial or not industrial, institutional buyers saying, we want zero waste campuses, to also, companies like PepsiCo and Danone leading the way on actually delivering on that, right, with their packaging. And then, the manufacturers like Danimer, also kind of stepping up to the plate, and Futamura and others, and then also, of course, the printers and laminators and actual, final kind of packaging finishers, right? People like Hemp. So all of those elements of the ecosystem are kind of coming together now to create this moment where there's so many more possibilities than there ever were before.
And I think this is part of the power of you and the company innovating towards regeneration. There was a bunch of different steps in the system that you had to kind of work on. And like I'm seeing there's, you talked there in detail about the technology of bringing the packaging together. Then there's also, before that, there was the chemistry that we spoke of getting to the PLAs or the PHAs or whatever, or the fungus-based wrap, whatever it's going to be, that sort of biology, chemical technology. And then there's the, from the earth, the starting point of earth, there's the growing whatever is the feedstock for those things in a regenerative way. And each of those places need attention, investment, and development. But I think one thing that I was hearing there that's really exciting is that what has pushed all of it forward is the way you not necessarily worked with one of those or even any of those three spots, but that you had some regenerative thinking about the industry, about the business social ecosystem that needed to come together in order to invest in and unlock those other areas. So yeah, I guess my question is like, what else, like, it's not done yet. Like, what else can we do to help the industry shift or to change the larger system that you see? And where should we start? Should we all just be finding, regenerative farmers that want to grow packaging, or is it in these, larger industry groups? What do you see are some of the kind of points we should be aiming at for that larger systemic change that you've been successful in creating?
Yeah, great question. I think there's, I would point to three different pieces right now, that are kind of gaps in that ecosystem. One, I think, is consumer awareness. I think that is kind of lagging behind, where kind of brands and even kind of the packaging innovators are right now. It's really shifting this consumer mindset around packaging, and opening up, consumer perception, to the living element of packaging. And that I think will create a stronger pull that will further kind of animate the industry. The other piece I think is policy. So right now we are in a policy environment in which the petrochemical industry is heavily subsidized. Part of that subsidy is the way in which microplastics are not are externalized in terms of the true cost of using those materials. So we need policies that incorporate or bring in elements of kind of true cost accounting into the cost of petrochemical derived materials, so that those are actually captured and embedded in the cost of use of those things, right? A good example of that is, for example, in California right now, we've got the California Plastics Coalition that's working together with some brands, our friends at Dr. Bronner's and others, that have just gotten a ballot initiative. It's not like 100%, but it's like 85%. It's looking really good that we've got this ballot initiative on the ballot for 2022 that's going to create a bottle bill, essentially, type of situation for single-use plastics. And that money that'll be derived, it'll be like a penny tax on single-use plastics that the manufacturers will have to kind of pony up, and that money will then go back to investing in infrastructure and also microplastic cleanup in our ecosystems. Which kind of brings me to the next point also, which is waste collection and waste collection of these materials. So we need to also invest in the recovery of these bioplastics to ensure that as we innovate and put them out there, that we actually have appropriate systems to recapture them and process them and bring them back to the earth. So that's the other piece too that's kind of...
Yeah, that's important, and something that Hauke's been working on, building up data and databases around so people can start to see what's out there more. But I think continuing to invest in that is key. So those three areas of consumer awareness, policy, environment, and the sort of waste collection, yes, seem really important. What do you think about the sort of supply-demand question of my sense is from some of the larger brands and manufacturers I've talked to, they're sort of like, yeah, that sounds nice, but there isn't enough supply, so we could never do it at our scale. What would you say to them, or what direction might you point them to, I don't know, somehow use their scale for change, or what would you invite?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's so many examples of brands, deciding that a certain ingredient or supply chain is of a strategic advantage to them, and then investing in that, supply landscape to ensure that adequate supply exists. And I think this again is that kind of thinking, that shift in thinking of kind of looking at packaging as kind of a third party commodity, right, thing that you just kind of slap over your primary output, right? And shifting that thinking now to valuing the packaging on the same level as we would, the product that's inside the package, right? Where if we were going to be doing an orange juice product, and we felt that there wasn't a significant, there wasn't enough supply of, regenerative orange juice growers for us, we would probably go out and invest in farmers to help them, transition in that way, right? So I think it's finding those nodal points along the supply chain and investing strategically in them to expand that supply. And at the same time, doing what you can do to pull the product, to pull the thing forward. So, I think one of the kind of design thinking traps that people fall into with packaging is this sense that, well, the solution I want doesn't exist. And this solution is imperfect, therefore we're not actually going to change anything because, the consumers maybe don't care anyways, and I'm not really getting the benefit I want from it as a brand. And that's where, we need to overcome that thinking in packaging, because it's sort of like this pursuit of the perfect at the expense of progress, even for us, like when we started this, we had kind of sworn off PLA. And we said, there's no way that PLA is like a no-go for us. We're not going to use PLA. And at the time there was only GMO PLA. And so the industry has evolved, and, because brands like us have said, we're committed to this, we'll be open to that if it's non-GMO and if it's, sustainably sourced. It doesn't solve some of the other concerns that I have about PLA and like the performance of PLA in a marine environment, for example, but it gets us a little bit farther down that road. And I think that was one of the hurdles that we had to overcome as an organization, to move ourselves forward, and that I see a lot of other organizations also kind of stumbling on, is this idea of like, well, there's not really, municipal composters where our consumers are to even collect this material, so why should we bother, right? And that kind of thinking, I think, fails to recognize that what's being called for here is a whole like paradigm shift, and therefore, we all have to do our part in kind of moving the paradigm, even if the piece that you're doing isn't the complete solution. It's
almost like what you were saying at the beginning about consumers being too focused on themselves as opposed to seeing the larger system. It's the same thing, but a level up, where the brand is like, well, this isn't perfect for me, so forget it, not seeing, the influence and impact it could have to push something in direction for the larger industry.
Exactly.
Yeah. So we just had a question in the chat, and other folks are also welcome to pop questions in the chat or raise your hand if you want to come off mute and ask Jane a question. But there was a question there about hemp and sort of the potential for hemp, and I guess I would throw in there other fiber crops, from canaf to other things, in terms of part of this solution and in moving towards regenerative packaging. Is there a place for the sort of plant-based fiber crops that aren't necessarily from forestry, where our paper mostly comes from, but to fill a role or a niche in somewhere you see in the sort of packaging ecosystem?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, I have seen a rigid like bottle cap that was hemp, that was interesting. I think with those, it sort of is a question of, I don't know that much about hemp right now, like where it's at in terms of like flexible films and rigids. But I think it would be a question of, how easily can you transform, that fiber into, to give it kind of the minimum kind of barrier and primarily moisture and oxygen barriers that would be needed in a manufacturing environment and in a food environment. So, I think that those fibers for sure have incredible potential, from a kind of a cellulosic perspective. There's a huge amount there to work with, but, I don't know that much more at this point.
Okay, cool. If you're thinking about the sort of this topic of the wider industry and what needs to shift, are there particular individual people or companies or sort of leaders that if you could get a bunch of them in the room to just like sit down and hash it out, have some industry transforming initiative, I don't know, who would they be, and what would you have them work on?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. I'd like to think about this one. I think for sure it would be a policymaker, like a really big time policymaker, maybe like the Secretary of Agriculture. I think we need someone who, similar to like how the Secretary of Energy, advocates for the energy industry, we need somebody out there on, kind of the agricultural side, who sees the potential of these materials and the benefit to, American farmers and kind of agriculture in general, and the potential there, who will go to the plate and kind of go to bat on the policy side. I thought about the EPA too, but I think the EPA tends to be more on the enforcement side, so we need somebody who's going to be more of like a cheerleader, right? Who's going to come in and tell a reluctant industry, hey, we got your back, and here's the benefit for you. And I think also, I'd want to see like the composting czar of America. I'm not sure who that person is. There is a U.S. Composters Council, so perhaps the leader of that group. who could come to the table and really think through, innovative ways to expand not only access to municipal composting, but also the processing of those materials. Because right now, those municipal composters are designed around a system, in which like yard waste and food waste was the input, right? And those things, and they were designed under an economic model with like a 45-day pile turn. So for them to like meet their economic targets and to actually be a profitable business, anything that comes in their door must leave their door as soil, usable soil, within 45 days. And most of these bioplastics, are being they're being designed and tested to 85 days. So, we need some kind of, mechanism. And I think you could probably separate them out and cut them and shift them and, kind of turn them into smaller molecules, and perhaps have a different way of processing them at the composting facility. So definitely want those people on board as well. And then I think probably like the world's best marketer, like maybe we need like, I don't know, someone from social media to come in and design an amazing campaign that's going to, open up consumer awareness around the truth of packaging, right? The connection between our joyful convenience factor and microplastics, and not do so in like a downer kind of a way, but in a way that kind of shows a new journey and how we can all be a part of it.
Yeah. Wow. I like the idea of both the sort of composting czar. Because composting, it seems like in that earth to earth structure that you've been thinking of, getting materials ultimately that, can be composted is important and key. And we've talked about a bunch of that side of it. But then the getting it back to earth is the other side. And that seems like something that really needs work, because it's, what percent probably in the US actually gets composted currently? It's probably
3%.
tiny. 3%.
Yeah, 3%.
Yeah.
Yeah, small.
Let's see. There was a question that came in here from Eva. She's saying, what would you say is the best thing for consumers to do? As an individual consumer, what should I do to move towards regenerative packaging?
I definitely support brands who are embracing regenerative packaging. So, doing your homework on brands, being an informed consumer, and making packaging choices that, making the same kind of mindful choices with the brands you support with relationship to their packaging as you would, to the ingredients within. So for me, that really looks like, even though, I know that my kids love that one seaweed snack, if I'm going to get it, I'm going to get it in bulk, right? In the giant sheets and cut it down for them, rather than like the individually packaged, plastic where you've got by weight more plastic than product inside, but then it's kind of packaged in more plastic, right? So thinking through ways in which you can create convenience for yourself out of perhaps a larger kind of bulk packaging, rather than kind of individually packaged sachets. And so, so supporting the brands that are making, mindful decisions around packaging and putting positive options out there. And then also making choices for yourself and your own consumption that I think minimize and reduce the use of plastic.
On that same route, there's a question here about brands. Like, who are some of those? What other innovative directions are you seeing out there? Not even necessarily, or it'd be cool to hear who's like got it and it's out there and great, we can go buy it. But then I don't know, what's on the horizon? Who's innovating behind the scenes, isn't quite to market yet?
I think, there's so much exciting innovation out there. And I think much of which is still behind the scenes, so I can't really talk too much about it. But we're really just beginning to see serious commitment from large brands to tackling particularly difficult parts of their, packaging, whether it's like aligning in a otherwise cardboard container that's maybe containing something like a wet product within, really, really working hard to innovate that lining so that you can actually get to something that's compostable, and putting the time into, the field tests and trials to ensure you have that stability. I think many brands, they're making claims on packaging, but there may be more information on their website. It's difficult right now for brands to find ways to talk to consumers about this, because it's complex, I think, as you can see from this conversation, and it's nuanced. And there's also a lot of, I think rightfully, there's a lot of kind of consumer watchdogging around greenwashing in the industry, right? So it's very difficult to kind of talk about plastics, and to say something as plastic free, for example, it's, that some of the terminology that's easy for consumers to understand, it has been kind of red flagged by the FTC, for example. So really, doing your homework, becoming aware. And I think also, like, talking to your friends about it. If you consider yourself somebody who's passionate about this and has kind of figured out a few things that work for you, finding ways to share that with, your friends and family, I think is really powerful also.
So Sarah looks like has raised her hand, so she should be able to unmute. Go ahead, Sarah.
Hi, Jane.
Sarah.
I have a question about, do you feel that individual consumers can have an impact on a company by contacting them directly about their packaging? And I'm thinking specifically about, first, I guess two buckets of companies that have a lot of logos on them, like Numi Tea does, like organic, non-GMO, fair trade. So those kinds of companies, I feel like, are probably like perhaps working on something and maybe hearing from consumers who say, like, I love your product, I just wish that you would do something about your packaging, if you feel like that is impactful. And also on the other extreme of the companies that are like not doing anything, but still like going, making an effort to contact them and say, I like your product, I just wish that I could recycle the packaging when I was done with it, or have you thought of joining TerraCycle or something? So I'm just curious, like, Numi started, was that at all driven by consumers' expectations and asking about the packaging, or was that all internal? And then generally, just, do you feel like individual consumers like myself can make an impact in pushing companies towards sustainable packaging?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's a little bit of both. When we started, it was really kind of, we were, I think, ahead of where most of our consumers were in terms of the expectation. As we've moved along, the last 10 years of this project, we have some consumers that have moved past us, and we have some consumers that are still, kind of haven't caught up yet with this. So, and having that reminder from consumers, is really actually very helpful. We do keep a consumer complaint log, which is, really any kind of consumer query. I think most companies do this. And we monitor it. We have a way of like classifying each type of kind of complaint or comment or whatever into different categories. And so we can watch kind of trends in kind of consumer awareness and consumer concern. And that is something that is either kind of validating the direction that we're on, or giving us like further incentive to continue pushing on a particularly thorny issue, or just to kind of keep the conversation top of mind. So I would definitely recommend that I would say that reaching out to brands, even if you don't get a response, somebody's reading it. And, definitely brands do pay attention if a consumer says, I love your product, but I'm not going to purchase it again because of the packaging, right? Or XYZ, right? That's definitely something that, captures the attention of a brand, because for every consumer that is maybe writing in, there's a certain number of consumers out there who have the same thought that didn't bother to write in.
I have a question that's more about from a buyer's perspective, or somebody, either looking at purchasing different packaging or purchasing products that are packaged in certain ways. If there's any sort of resource either that you or OCS Squared has built that's more like a buyer's guide for like what questions to be asking, what certifications to look for, anything like that that you know of or would want to work on creating?
I would love to work on creating one. I think that would be really cool. And I know that How Good is up to something there. So really we'll be excited when that tool is available. You know, I think really looking at, you know, as I mentioned, like the LCA piece is a little bit limiting, you know, and can be misleading. You know, I think the where we're at as an industry, you know, we are emerging and it is still nascent. Like both of those things are true. So really first and foremost is, you know, clicking off the boxes of functionality. And, you know, if you come to one that a functionality box that doesn't totally click, I think it's being ready, being prepared as a brand to continue forward, you know, even though you don't have that nice clean check, right? Because it takes that partnership and that commitment between the brand and the suppliers to actually, you know, innovate and kind of customize in such a way that it actually clicks into place. And I think most people don't realize just how customized packaging is. And, you know, there's a specific sort of recipe for our packaging that's unique to our packaging, just as unique as the tea inside, right? So you have to, it stands to reason then that you have to also be ready to kind of innovate that recipe together and kind of fine tune it.
Okay, last big question from my end. And then if there's no one for anyone else, we'll wrap a few minutes early and give people a couple minutes back. But thinking about investing, if you had 100 million to invest into regenerative packaging, you know, we talked about those different areas of the regen ag and the sort of chemistry and then the technology side of things and then the wider industry. What would you do? Where would you put that 100 million to shift the whole industry towards regenerative packaging?
100 million. That's good. I think I would probably put it towards policy, you know, kind of really, I think matching the lobbying strength and weight of the petrochemical industry and putting that into the kind of compostable materials industry on a lobbying point of view. And then also this end of life materials collection. Those would be the two legs that we need to really support right now.
Awesome. Okay, unless there's questions for anyone else, I'm going to say this is great. This is some of the first, you know, concentrated realm of thought on regenerative packaging and what that can mean. And we've covered a lot of ground here. Jane, I want to see if there's any kind of last overview or final comment you want to make or things you want to ask us or send us out to do in our respective arenas. But yeah, I want to thank you for coming in. But yeah, see if there's any last words you want to wrap us up on.
No, just thank you, Ethan, for leading this conversation and for everybody who's listening and also, you know, putting your minds and your passion and your attention towards this important issue. I think it's really like the dots are beginning to be connected here, and it really takes everyone on board to drive us forward. So thank you all.
All right, and if anyone wants to connect with Jane, you can just, I'm easy to find. You can send me an email. I'm doing double opt-in introductions for this, but just shoot me an email and I bet Jane will be happy to chat with you. So thanks everyone, and look forward to seeing you at upcoming sessions on regenerative agriculture, biodiversity, and planetary health. Bye.